The emergency klaxons screaming through Arcturus Prime Academy weren't for a fire drill. They weren't for a reactor leak or an asteroid impact either. No, these alarms meant something far worse. The Apex-class predator in Professor Vek's xenobiology lab had broken free from its quantum restraints, and according to the automated threat assessment, it would kill everything in the building within the next 4 minutes. Every student, teacher, and maintenance drone was evacuating in pure terror. Every being except one. While 300 alien students fled in panic through the corridors, 18-year-old human exchange student Jake Morrison sat cross-legged on the floor of Lab 7, completely motionless, as 2 tons of crystalline death prowled in slow circles around him. The Nexari Shadowclaw, a creature that had earned its classification by single-handedly wiping out an entire Zephyrian colony, had its obsidian claws extended, its 6 eyes fixed on the strange, soft-skinned biped that refused to run. But here's what made the security footage go viral across 17 star systems. The apex predator wasn't preparing to strike. It was curious. And in 30 seconds, it would do something that would fundamentally change how the galaxy viewed both humans and monsters forever. Because sometimes, the most dangerous predator in the room isn't the one with the biggest claws. 24 hours earlier, Jake Morrison had been just another human trying not to embarrass his entire species at the most prestigious Xenobiology Academy in the Outer Rim. Earth had fought for decades to get even one student accepted into Arcturus Prime's exchange program, and somehow, Jake, a farm kid from Montana who'd never seen an alien until 6 months ago, had won the lottery. Today, we observe the Nexari Shadowclaw. Professor Vex had announced to the mixed species class of 40 students. The Altarian's 4 arms gestured toward the massive containment unit humming with restraint fields. Indigenous to the death world of Nexus Prime, this apex predator represents the pinnacle of evolutionary aggression. Notice the adaptive camouflage scales, the molecular edge claws, and most importantly, the complete absence of fear response. Jake had pressed closer to the containment glass, ignoring the nervous chittering of his Zelanti classmates. Inside the quantum cage, the Shadowclaw was magnificent, 12 feet of flowing muscle beneath scales that shifted like liquid starlight. Its 6 eyes moved independently, constantly scanning for threats, opportunities, weaknesses. The Nexari Shadowclaw has no natural predators, Professor Vex continued, his usually steady voice carrying an edge of respect tinged with fear. It sits alone at the apex of its ecosystem. Adult specimens have been recorded surviving in hard vacuum for up to 6 hours, and their hunting success rate approaches 97%. Most of the class had instinctively stepped back from the containment unit. Jake stepped forward. "Human Jake," whispered Crix, his Polarian lab partner. Ice crystals forming on his carapace from anxiety. Perhaps maintaining distance would be prudent, but Jake wasn't listening. He was watching the way the Shadowclaw moved, not with the random pacing of a caged animal, but with purpose, intelligence. When their eyes met through the quantum glass, Jake felt something he'd never experienced before. Recognition. The creature tilted its massive head, scales shifting to mirror the laboratory's blue-white lighting. For 30 seconds, predator and human studied each other across the barrier that separated them. Then the Shadowclaw did something that made Professor Vex drop his datapad. It sat down and kept watching Jake. "Fascinating," the professor muttered, for arms working frantically to record readings. The specimen appears to be exhibiting investigative behavior rather than territorial aggression. Most unusual. What none of them knew was that the containment unit's quantum restraints had been suffering microfailures all week. The Academy's maintenance logs would later show 17 separate warnings that had been flagged as low priority by the automated systems. By morning, those microfailures would cascade into complete system collapse, and Jake Morrison would find himself face-to-face with the galaxy's most perfect killer, with nothing between them but 20 feet of empty air and the kind of choice that defines a species. Jake Morrison woke to the sound of his dormitory walls vibrating. At first, he thought it was another seismic adjustment. Arcturus Prime was notorious for its unstable tectonics. But the emergency lighting flickering on told a different story, and the announcement that followed made his blood freeze. "Code Apex. Code Apex. All personnel evacuate immediately. This is not a drill." Code Apex meant one thing: Something had broken free from the maximum security xenobiology labs. Jake's first instinct was to run like everyone else. The corridors filled with panicked aliens. Zelanti students screeching in harmonics that hurt human ears, Polarian ice forms shattering their way through doorframes, even the usually composed Altarian professors abandoning dignity in favor of survival. The building's automated systems were in full emergency mode, bulkhead doors slamming shut to contain the threat while transport pods screamed away from the academy grounds. But as Jake reached the main evacuation shaft, something made him stop. Through the chaos of fleeing bodies and emergency announcements, he heard it, a sound that didn't belong. Not the roar of an enraged predator or the crash of destruction he'd expected, but something else entirely. A low, resonant call that seemed almost lonely. Human Jake. Crix's voice cut through the noise as his Polarian friend spotted him. The evacuation shuttle departs in 90 seconds. We must. Go ahead, Jake said, surprising himself with how calm he sounded. I'll catch the next one. There may not be a next one. The containment breach originated from Lab 7. Your Professor Vex Shadowclaw. That stopped Jake cold. The Nexari Shadowclaw, the creature he'd spent the last 24 hours thinking about, the predator that had looked at him with what he could have sworn was intelligence, was loose somewhere in the building. Every rational part of his brain screamed at him to follow Crix to safety. Earth's first exchange student couldn't die on his second day. It would set back human-galactic relations by centuries. But something deeper, something that had nothing to do with logic, pulled him toward the laboratory levels instead of the evacuation zones. The emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red as Jake made his way through the abandoned corridors. Emergency bulkheads had sealed most of the routes, but his farm boy experience with tight spaces let him navigate the maintenance shafts that the automated systems had overlooked. As he got closer to Lab 7, the damage became apparent. Quantum restraint generators lay in sparking ruins. Their exotic matter containment fields collapsed into twisted metal. Claw marks scored the reinforced walls in patterns that suggested not random destruction but methodical exploration, like something had been systematically testing the limits of its prison before making its move. The final barrier between Jake and the laboratory was the emergency airlock that should have been impossible for him to override. But the Shadowclaw's escape had damaged more than just its cage. Security protocols were failing building-wide, and the lock cycled open at his touch. Beyond the airlock, Lab 7 waited in darkness, and somewhere in that darkness, the galaxy's perfect predator was free. The laboratory was a disaster zone. Quantum containment units lay shattered like broken eggs, their exotic matter cores leaking streams of amber energy into the air. Emergency lighting flickered sporadically, casting moving shadows that made Jake's heart hammer against his ribs. The Nexari Shadowclaw could be anywhere, behind the overturned specimen tables, crouched among the ruined equipment, or simply invisible thanks to its adaptive camouflage. Jake forced himself to breathe slowly, remembering his grandfather's advice about dealing with mountain lions back on the Montana ranch. Don't run, don't make sudden movements, and whatever you do, don't show fear. Predators can smell fear from a mile away, and it makes them hungry. Of course, his grandfather had never dealt with an alien apex predator that could tear through reinforced titanium like tissue paper. A soft sound made Jake freeze, the whisper of claws against metal, somewhere to his left. His human eyes, adapted for Earth's bright daylight, struggled with the laboratory's emergency lighting, but movement caught his attention near the observation platform where Professor Vex had been lecturing just yesterday. There, a ripple in the air like heat distortion, but wrong somehow. The Shadowclaw's camouflage wasn't perfect. Jake could make out the outline of something massive moving with deliberate care among the wreckage. Every survival instinct screamed at him to back away slowly, to retreat through the airlock while he still could. But as Jake watched the creature move, he realized something that changed everything. The Shadowclaw wasn't hunting. It was investigating. The predator moved from one piece of equipment to another with what could only be described as scientific curiosity, its claws delicately probing damaged circuits, its head tilting as it examined the ruins of its former prison. When it reached the shattered remains of its quantum containment unit, the creature actually paused, scales shifting in what Jake somehow knew was disappointment. It took Jake a moment to understand what he was seeing. The Shadowclaw hadn't broken free in a rage. It had methodically solved the puzzle of its confinement, testing each component until it found the weakness that would grant its freedom. And now, rather than going on a killing spree like every xenobiologist predicted, it was exploring. The realization hit Jake like a physical blow. The creature was intelligent. Not just clever like a dolphin or tactical like a wolf pack, but genuinely, deeply intelligent in a way that the galaxy's xenobiologists had completely missed. They'd classified it as an apex predator, a perfect killing machine, when in reality it might be the first truly alien intelligence humanity had encountered. But that knowledge brought a new terror. If the Shadowclaw was intelligent, then it was choosing its actions deliberately. And right now, those 6 independently tracking eyes were all focused on the human who just stumbled into its laboratory. The creature's camouflage faded as it turned to face Jake fully, scales shifting from adaptive invisibility to a deep, warning crimson. 12 feet of alien muscle coiled with predatory grace. Obsidian claws extended like molecular-edge swords. Jake Morrison, 18 years old and very far from his Montana ranch, stood absolutely still and waited to see what the galaxy's most perfect predator would do next. For 30 seconds that felt like 30 hours, predator and human regarded each other across 20 feet of ruined laboratory. The Shadowclaw's 6 eyes tracked Jake's every micro-movement, the flutter of his pulse in his throat, the tiny shifts in his stance, the involuntary dilation of his pupils. Its scaled head tilted in a gesture that was unmistakably curious, and Jake realized with crystal clarity that the creature was analyzing him the same way he'd been analyzing it. The emergency klaxons chose that moment to shift to a new, more urgent pattern. Somewhere in the building's automated systems, sensors were detecting that the escaped predator had made contact with a potential victim, and the response was immediate. Blast shields began sealing over the laboratory's viewports while emergency sterilization protocols initialized. In 60 seconds, the lab would be flooded with lethal radiation designed to eliminate any biological threat. The Academy's AI had apparently decided that acceptable losses were preferable to letting an apex predator escape into the general population. Jake felt rather than heard the deep thrumming as the sterilization systems powered up. The Shadowclaw's scales immediately shifted to a brilliant warning pattern. Somehow it understood the danger too. But instead of looking for an escape route, the creature took a single, deliberate step toward the human who'd wandered into its temporary domain. Then another step, and another. Jake's mouth went dry as survival instincts older than civilization screamed at him to run, to fight, to do anything except stand motionless while 2 tons of crystalline death approached. But something his grandfather had once said echoed in his mind. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is what everyone expects you to do. Every xenobiologist in the galaxy would expect him to flee. Every tactical manual would advise immediate retreat. Every computer simulation would predict that a human's only chance against a Nexari Shadowclaw was distance and superior firepower. So Jake Morrison did the one thing that no one, not the professors, not the tactical computers, not even the Shadowclaw itself, expected. As the galaxy's most perfect predator closed the distance between them, he slowly, carefully, sat down on the laboratory floor. The Shadowclaw froze mid-step, its 6 eyes widening in what Jake could have sworn was surprise. Its scales flickered through a rapid sequence of colors, confusion patterns that Professor Vex had never mentioned in his lectures because no one had ever seen a Nexari Shadowclaw confused before. The sterilization countdown reached 30 seconds. Emergency lighting bathed the laboratory in hellish red as automated systems prepared to eliminate both predator and prey with equal efficiency. But Jake kept his eyes locked on the creature's 6 optical organs, watching intelligence work behind those alien features as the Shadowclaw processed this completely unexpected development. Because in 30 seconds, the radiation would kill them both. And in 29 seconds, Jake Morrison was about to discover whether his gut instinct about alien intelligence was brilliant insight, or the last mistake he'd ever make. The Nexari Shadowclaw sat down. Not the graceful crouch of a predator preparing to pounce. Not the cautious stance of a creature ready for fight or flight. It simply sat. Like a dog. Like Jake's old retriever back home who used to sit patiently by the kitchen door, waiting for permission to come inside. The sterilization countdown hit 15 seconds, and the creature that had terrorized 3 star systems worth of xenobiologists made a sound Jake had never heard before. A low, almost musical whine that resonated in harmonics his human ears could barely detect. It wasn't aggression or warning. It was questioning. "Yeah," Jake said softly, his voice barely audible over the emergency klaxons. "This is pretty messed up, isn't it?" The Shadowclaw's head tilted, scales shifting to a pattern Jake instinctively read as attentiveness. Its 6 eyes focused on his face with laser intensity, and Jake realized that it was listening. Not just hearing his words, but actively listening the way humans listened when they were trying to understand something complex and important. 10 seconds to sterilization. Jake reached into his jacket pocket, moving slowly enough that the creature could track every gesture. His fingers found the emergency beacon that every exchange student carried, a device that would signal his position to rescue teams. But instead of activating it for rescue, Jake did something that would have horrified every safety instructor in the academy. He turned off its location transponder and activated its universal translator function. 5 seconds. "Computer," Jake said quietly, "translate to Nexari linguistic patterns. Message, I don't want to hurt you either." The translator's synthesized voice filled the laboratory with sounds no human throat could make. Complex harmonic structures that resonated like crystalline chimes. The Shadowclaw's entire body went rigid, scales cycling through colors so rapidly they blurred into prismatic starlight. 3 seconds. The creature looked directly into Jake's eyes and spoke, not the roar or hiss everyone expected from an apex predator, but a carefully modulated response that the translator rendered in perfectly clear English. "Then why do your people cage what they do not understand?" 2 seconds. Jake felt his world tilt sideways. The Shadowclaw wasn't just intelligent, it was philosophical, and it had been trying to communicate with its captors from the beginning, only to be treated as nothing more than a dangerous animal. 1 second. The sterilization field engaged, and immediately shut down. Through the laboratory's reinforced viewports, Jake could see the stunned faces of Professor Vex and the entire Academy emergency response team. The Shadowclaw had placed one massive paw over Jake's emergency beacon, somehow using its own bioelectric field to amplify the device's override signal and cancel the sterilization protocol. It had saved both their lives with technology it had never seen before, using principles it had apparently deduced from watching laboratory equipment for less than a day. "My people cage things when they're afraid," Jake answered honestly, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "And we're afraid of you because you're better at surviving than we are." The Shadowclaw considered this, its scales settling into a deep blue pattern that somehow conveyed contemplation. When it spoke again, Jake heard something that changed everything. "Your fear makes you interesting. Most species simply flee or attack. But you sit. You listen. You choose understanding over survival instinct." Then the creature did something that would become the most watched video in galactic history. It lay down beside Jake, its crystalline scales catching the laboratory's emergency, lighting like a living constellation, and rested its massive head near the human's shoulder. "I have been alone since my capture," it said through the translator. "Your species may fear me, but they also choose curiosity over terror. This is unprecedented in my experience." Jake reached out slowly, his hand hovering inches from the creature's scaled neck. The Shadowclaw, this being that could have killed him in a dozen different ways, tilted its head to make contact easier. The moment Jake's palm touched alien scales, he felt a connection that went beyond translator technology, beyond species barriers, beyond every xenobiological theory in the Academy's databases. The creature's body hummed with a subsonic purr that seemed to resonate in Jake's bones, and its 6 eyes drifted closed in what could only be described as contentment. Through the laboratory viewports, 300 of the galaxy's finest xenobiologists watched in stunned silence as their most dangerous specimen curled up next to a human farm boy and fell asleep. The footage of Jake Morrison sitting calmly with a sleeping Nexari Shadowclaw spread through the galactic networks like wildfire. Within hours, xenobiologists from 17 different species were demanding to know how a human exchange student had accomplished what their best researchers had failed to do in decades of study. The answer, it turned out, was embarrassingly simple. Jake had treated the creature like a person instead of a specimen. The Nexari Shadowclaw isn't just an apex predator, Professor Vex explained to the Emergency Xenobiology Council 3 days later, his 4 arms gesturing at the data streams filling the conference hologram. It's a researcher. It was studying us as intently as we were studying it, and it had been attempting communication from the moment of capture. Our classification protocols simply weren't designed to recognize intelligence that doesn't follow familiar patterns. Jake himself had become something of a celebrity, though he handled it with the same calm he'd shown in the laboratory. When asked by reporters how he'd known the creature wouldn't hurt him, he'd simply shrugged and said, "It never tried to hurt anyone. It just wanted out of its cage." The Shadowclaw, who had chosen the human name Sebastian, after learning that Jake's grandfather had been called that, was now officially classified as a sentient being rather than a specimen. The creature had agreed to remain at Arcturus Prime Academy, but as a visiting researcher rather than a captive subject. Its insights into quantum physics and bioengineering were already revolutionizing multiple fields of study. But perhaps the most significant change was in how the galaxy viewed humanity itself. The same species that other civilizations had dismissed as primitive and overly aggressive had produced someone who could see past fear to find friendship with the universe's most perfect predator. Humans, Sebastian had observed during one of his first official interviews, do not simply survive. They connect. They find kinship in the most unlikely places. This is perhaps the most dangerous trait any species could possess, and the most valuable. As Jake walked through the academy corridors now, he wasn't just Earth's exchange student. He was living proof that sometimes the scariest thing about humanity wasn't their capacity for violence, but their apparently unlimited capacity for making friends with things that should, by all logic, want to eat them. The emergency protocols had been quietly updated across the academy. The next time something broke free from containment, the first response wouldn't be sterilization. It would be to check if anyone had tried talking to it first. Because in a galaxy full of apex predators and advanced civilizations, the most dangerous species might just be the one that looks at a monster and sees a potential friend. And that's a story that's still being written, one unlikely friendship at a time. But Sebastian wasn't the only misunderstood monster in Arcturus Prime's xenobiology labs. In our next story, you'll discover what happened when the Academy's extinct specimens turned out to be very much alive, and very grateful to the human maintenance worker who'd been leaving them snacks for months.